The corner booth was my sanctuary. It was less a choice and more a slow, gravitational pull that had settled me into its worn red vinyl and the permanent scent of coffee and frying bacon. For 6 months, since I'd moved to the microscopic town of Northwood to try and unjam the gears of my life, and my second novel, I had followed a routine so rigid it had become a ritual. Arrive at 3 in the afternoon, when the lunch rush was a greasy memory and the dinner crowd was still a distant thought. Take the last booth by the window. Order a black coffee and a slice of whatever pie looked least apologetic. And watch Grant. Watching Grant was an art I had perfected. It was a study in quiet competence, in the economy of movement that came from a man who knew his space down to the last salt shaker. Grant owned the corner booth. He'd inherited it, the town gossip mill supplied, from his parents. He was a fixture, as much a part of the place as the humming neon sign and the checkered linoleum floor. He was maybe 40, a decade older than me, with thick, dark hair that was starting to show threads of silver at the temples, and a permanent shadow of stubble on his jaw that suggested he had better things to do than shave every single morning. He moved like a man who was comfortable in his own skin, with a steadiness that I, a man made of 99% anxiety and tangled thoughts, could only envy. He'd wipe down the counter, his broad shoulders moving with an easy rhythm. He'd lean against the pass-through window, speaking in a low, calm voice to the cook. And sometimes, he'd catch me looking. He never called me out on it. He'd just meet my eyes for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, before giving me a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Then he'd turn back to his work, leaving me with a heart that hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My life had become a series of these silent, one-sided conversations. My laptop screen remained stubbornly blank, the cursor a blinking accusation. My tiny, rented cabin in the woods felt less like a writer's retreat and more like a self-imposed exile. The loneliness was a physical weight, a constant pressure in my chest. The only thing that eased it was the 3 hours I spent each day at the diner, existing in the same orbit as Grant. It was pathetic, I knew. I was a man in his late 20s, pining over a small-town diner owner like a teenager with a crush. But it was the only thing that felt real in a life that had become a performance of productivity. That day, the sky had been the color of a bruise all morning. The forecast had promised a dusting of snow, but by the time I settled into my booth, the flakes were coming down thick and fast, sticking to the windows and blurring the world outside into a swirl of white. The diner was emptier than usual. The few patrons who had braved the weather finished their meals quickly, their conversations laced with concerns about the roads. I watched them leave, one by one, until it was just me, Grant, and the teenage waitress, Brenda, who was more interested in her phone than the burgeoning blizzard. Grant was at the counter, methodically refilling the sugar shakers. I could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. The storm was getting worse, the wind howling around the corners of the old building. I should have left hours ago. My beat-up sedan was probably already half buried in the parking lot. But the thought of going back to my cold, silent cabin was unbearable. Here, there was the low hum of the coolers, the smell of coffee, the solid presence of Grant. It was a flimsy shield against the isolation, but it was better than nothing. "Roads are looking pretty bad, Leo," Grant said, his voice cutting through the quiet. He didn't look up from his task. He always knew my name, though I'd never formally introduced myself. He knew my order, too. Black coffee, apple pie unless it was cherry day. Yeah, I managed, my voice sounding rusty. Guess I lost track of time, it was a lie. I had been tracking time with painstaking precision, watching the clock on the wall, bargaining with myself for just 5 more minutes. Brenda finally looked up from her phone, her eyes wide as she stared out the window. "My dad's gonna kill me. He told me to be home before 5". Grant set down the sugar shaker and wiped his hands on his apron. He looked at her, and his expression softened. It was a look I'd seen him give the regulars, a kind of paternal patience. "Go on, Brenda. Get your stuff. I'll close up." "Really?" she asked, her face flooded with relief. "Go. Be safe." She scrambled to get her coat, and with a hurried, "Thanks, Grant," she was out the door, a gust of frigid air and swirling snow chasing her out. The bell above the door jingled, a lonely, cheerful sound in the sudden silence. And then it was just us. My heart picked up its pace. This was new territory. I was usually long gone by the time he closed. The diner, once a public space where I could hide in plain sight, now felt intensely private. The silence was thick, broken only by the howl of the wind and the rhythmic clink of Grant stacking clean mugs behind the counter. I should leave. I should say something, make my excuses, and brave the storm. It was the sensible thing to do. I stayed put. Grant finished with the mugs and turned, leaning his back against the counter. He crossed his arms over his chest, the fabric of his dark blue work shirt pulling taut across his shoulders. He looked directly at me, and this time, his gaze didn't waver. It was steady, searching. "You're not going anywhere in that car of yours," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Probably not," I admitted, my fingers tracing the rim of my cold coffee cup. "The plows won't be out on the side roads until morning. If we're lucky," he pushed off the counter and walked towards the front door. He moved with that same unhurried grace, his footsteps solid on the linoleum. I watched as he reached for the large, two-sided sign hanging in the window. With a quiet click, he flipped it from open to closed. The finality of the gesture echoed in the silent room. He had just officially shut out the rest of the world, and I was still inside. My stomach did a slow, nervous flip. This was the catalyst, the inciting incident my own fictional characters were always waiting for. A snowstorm. A diner. Two men, trapped by the weather. It was a cliché, but as I sat there, with the warmth of the diner seeping into my bones and the object of my 6-month obsession standing 10 feet away, it felt less like a trope and more like fate. He turned from the door, his eyes finding mine again. "Looks like you're stuck here for a while." A strange sense of calm washed over my anxiety. Stuck. Here. With him. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, a quiet, dangerous tendril of hope began to unfurl in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't just an observer in the corner booth. I was part of the scene. Grant moved back behind the counter, shedding his apron and tossing it onto a stool. He rolled up the sleeves of his shirt, revealing strong, capable forearms dusted with dark hair. I'd watched those hands work 100 times, flipping pancakes, gripping a coffee pot, wiping down tables. Now, seeing them in the dimming light of the late afternoon, they seemed different, more personal. He moved around the small kitchen space, the familiar sounds of him working now creating a strange, domestic soundtrack to our isolation. The clatter of a pot, the rush of water from the faucet, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I remained in my booth, a silent spectator, feeling like an intruder in a space that had suddenly become intensely intimate. The public diner had vanished with the flip of that sign. This was Grant's kitchen. I was sitting at his table. My laptop was closed on the seat beside me, its blank screen no longer a source of shame. My entire focus had narrowed to the man moving with quiet purpose behind the counter. He wasn't talking, and I was grateful for the silence. It allowed me to observe without the pressure of conversation. I noticed the small things I couldn't see from my usual distance. The way a single lock of his dark hair fell across his forehead. The faint, old scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The lines around his eyes that crinkled when he squinted at something in the fridge. He was more real, more human than the idealized version I had constructed in my head. He pulled out a block of cheese, a loaf of bread, and a carton of tomato soup. My stomach rumbled, a loud, embarrassing betrayal in the quiet room. Grant heard it. A small smile touched the corner of his mouth, but he didn't comment. He just set about making what looked like grilled cheese sandwiches, the movements economical and sure. "Hope you're hungry," he said, his back still to me. "I could eat," I replied, my voice a little too loud in the stillness. He worked without fuss, the smell of melting butter and toasting bread soon filling the air, mingling with the ever-present aroma of coffee. It was a comforting, nostalgic scent that made the diner feel less like a business and more like a home. He poured the soup into 2 mugs, slid the golden brown sandwiches onto 2 plates, and then did something that made my breath catch. He didn't gesture for me to come to the counter. He brought the plates over and slid into the opposite side of my booth. My booth. He set my plate and mug down in front of me. The space, which had always felt expansive when I was alone, now felt impossibly small. His knee brushed against mine under the table. A jolt, like static electricity, shot up my leg. I pulled back instinctively, my cheeks flushing with heat. "Sorry," I mumbled. "Don't be," he said, his voice low. He didn't move his leg. He just started eating his sandwich, his gaze directed out the window at the swirling snow. The world outside was a tempest, but inside my booth, a different kind of storm was brewing. We ate in a silence that was both comfortable and charged with unspoken tension. I was acutely aware of every small sound. The scrape of his spoon against the ceramic mug, the soft crunch of his sandwich, the sound of his breathing. I dissected every detail. He held his sandwich with a firm but gentle grip. He took his time, chewing slowly, thoughtfully. He looked completely at ease, as if having a stranded writer in his diner after hours was a perfectly normal occurrence. I, on the other hand, was a mess of internal analysis. Why is he being so nice? He could have just told me to wait it out. Why is he sitting with me? He could eat at the counter. Does he feel it too? This current in the air between us. Or was I just projecting my own desperate yearning onto a simple act of kindness? That was more likely. He was a good guy. The whole town knew it. Of course, he wouldn't kick someone out into a blizzard. Good soup, I said, just to break the spell of my own thoughts. He turned his head from the window, his eyes meeting mine. They were a dark, warm brown, like black coffee. My mom's recipe. The secret is a pinch of smoked paprika. It's really good. He gave me a small, genuine smile. It transformed his face, softening the stern lines of his mouth. Thanks. That smile was a meaningful touch all on its own. It felt like a reward, a small crack in his stoic facade. He held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and my heart did that familiar, frantic dance. I was drowning in the silence, in the proximity, in the simple, overwhelming fact of his presence. After we finished eating, he took our plates back to the counter. I watched him, my sandwich a warm, heavy knot in my stomach. The intimacy of the shared meal lingered in the air. He rinsed the dishes and left them in the sink, then leaned against it, crossing his arms and looking back at me. So, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. You're a writer. It was a statement, not a question. I'm trying to be, I corrected, the familiar shame of my failure prickling at me. What do you write? Novels. Or one novel. And I'm trying to write another. Trying. I shrugged, feeling exposed. It's not coming. He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Writer's block. The Mount Everest of writer's block. I attempted a self-deprecating laugh, but it came out as a weak, strangled sound. He didn't laugh. He just kept watching me with that steady, unnerving gaze. Why'd you pick Northwood to get unstuck? Not much happens here. That was the point, I said, the honesty surprising me. I thought if I got away from the noise, I'd be able to hear the story. Turns out the silence is just as loud. He considered this for a moment. Sometimes you need a different kind of noise. He pushed off the counter and walked toward a back room I'd never paid much attention to. He disappeared inside, and I heard a faint rummaging sound. My mind raced. What was he doing? Was he getting a blanket? Was he going to tell me I could sleep in the booth? The thought sent another wave of heat through me. He emerged a moment later holding a worn, wooden box. He brought it over to the table and set it down between us. It was a checkerboard, the wood dark and smooth with age. My dad and I used to play for hours on slow days, he said, his voice softer now, tinged with nostalgia. He opened the box. The red and black wooden checkers were nestled inside, their surfaces worn from countless games. You play? This was the shared experience. The breakthrough. It wasn't some grand, dramatic event. It was a dusty box of checkers and a simple invitation. It was a way to pass the time, to build a bridge across the silence. It's been a while, I said. It'll come back to you. He set up the board, his large hands moving with surprising dexterity as he placed the small wooden discs in their squares. The simple act felt deliberate, an anchor in the swirling uncertainty of the situation. We were going to play a game. We were going to do something normal in a situation that felt anything but. We played. The only sounds were the soft click of the wooden checkers on the board, the relentless howl of the wind outside, and our own quiet breathing. The game became a conversation in itself. Grant played like he did everything else, with a quiet, deliberate strategy. He was patient, thoughtful, never rushing a move. I was more reckless, my mind still buzzing with a nervous energy that made it hard to focus. He beat me easily the first game. Double or nothing, he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips as he set the board up again. You're on, I replied, feeling a spark of something competitive, something playful, that I hadn't felt in months. The second game was different. I slowed down. I started watching him, really watching him, trying to read his strategy in the subtle shifts of his expression. I noticed the way he'd lightly tap his finger on the table when he was thinking, the slight furrow of his brow. He wasn't just a stoic, unreadable man. He was thinking, planning, and I was on the other side of the board, a part of his focus. The diner grew darker as the afternoon bled into evening. The snow outside had piled up against the windows, muffling the sound of the wind and cocooning us even further from the world. Grant didn't turn on more lights. We were left in the warm, isolated glow of the single lamp hanging over our booth. It cast long shadows across the room, making the familiar space feel mysterious and new. "It's your move," he said softly, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. I looked down at the board. He had me cornered. Again, I sighed, leaning back against the vinyl seat. "You're too good at this." "Just patient," he corrected. He wasn't looking at the board anymore. He was looking at me. That intense, unreadable gaze was back, but in the dim, golden light, it felt less intimidating and more inquisitive. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" he asked. The question was so direct, so unexpected, it felt like a physical blow. It was the moment of softness, the crack in the stoic armor I never saw coming. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "Is it that obvious?" "You have a look," he said, not unkindly. "Like you're watching the world through a window." He had just perfectly described my entire existence for the past 6 months. He saw me. He hadn't just been serving me coffee and pie. He had been observing me, just as I had been observing him. The realization sent a tremor through me. The one-sided nature of my fascination had been a fantasy. This was real. Yeah, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I do. This town can be like that," he said, leaning forward slightly, his forearms resting on the edge of the table. "It's small. Everyone knows everyone. If you're on the outside, it's hard to find a way in." "You're not on the outside," I pointed out. "You're the center of it. This place," I gestured around the dim diner. "This is the heart of Northwood." A flicker of something, sadness, maybe, passed through his eyes. Being at the center of a crowd is its own kind of lonely. You serve them, you listen to their stories, but you're always on the other side of the counter. There it was, a shared vulnerability. We were two lonely men, sitting on opposite sides of a checkerboard, but in that moment, we were in the exact same place. The silence that fell between us was different now. It wasn't empty or awkward. It was full. It was a space of mutual understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of a shared ache. And then, as if on cue, the single light above our booth flickered once, twice, and died. The diner was plunged into almost total darkness. My breath hitched. The sudden absence of light was a shock to the system. The only illumination came from the faint, bluish glow of the emergency exit sign over the door and the pale, reflected light of the snow outside the windows. The world had shrunk to the dimensions of our booth. I could no longer see the checkerboard, the counter, the rest of the diner. I could only sense Grant, a dark, solid shape sitting just a few feet away from me. I heard him shift, a rustle of fabric in the profound quiet. The sound of his breathing seemed impossibly loud. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The storm, the isolation, the shared confession, it had all been leading to this. The tipping point. The darkness had stripped away the last of our pretenses. There was nowhere left to hide. "Well?" Grant's voice came out of the dark, a low, calm anchor in the blackness. "Guess the power's out." "Yeah," I breathed. My voice was shaky. "I am here. In the dark. With him." My mind was chanting the words like a mantra. I heard another soft sound, the scrape of a chair, and then his presence was closer. He hadn't moved back to the counter. He had moved to the end of the booth, standing beside our table. I couldn't see his face, only his silhouette against the faint light from the window. "You okay, Leo?" he asked. His voice was softer now, gentler. "I'm fine," I lied. I was anything but fine. I was vibrating with a mixture of terror and exhilarating hope. Every nerve ending was on high alert. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap, the lingering aroma of coffee on his clothes. He was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the wind, a low, mournful moan outside the thick walls of the diner. The loaded interaction had arrived, stripped of all visual cues. It was just his voice, his presence, and the charged space between us. "You never did tell me what you're writing about," he said, his voice a low murmur that wrapped around me in the dark. It's a love story," I found myself saying, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Oh yeah." I could hear the smile in his voice. "Anyone I know?" The playful teasing, the flirty, ambiguous statement. He was testing the waters. He was giving me an opening. My heart hammered. This was it. This was the moment where I could retreat back into my safe, lonely shell, or I could take a terrifying leap of faith. I took a shaky breath. My hands were trembling in my lap. I clenched them into fists. "It's about a man who feels invisible," I began, my voice quiet but clear in the darkness. "And he goes to the same place every day, just to see someone who makes him feel seen, even if it's just for a few hours." The silence stretched. It was a taut, humming wire. I had said too much. I had laid my pathetic, lonely heart bare on the table between us, and he was going to laugh, or feel sorry for me, or just retreat into a polite, awkward silence until the lights came back on. But he didn't. His silhouette moved again. He wasn't retreating. He was coming closer. He rounded the edge of the table, and then he was standing right beside me, his leg brushing against mine. My entire body went rigid. "Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was right next to my ear. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. A shiver traced its way down my spine. I couldn't speak. I could only sit there, frozen, waiting for the verdict. And then he reached out. His hand, warm and calloused, covered mine where it rested on the vinyl seat. The touch was electric. It wasn't accidental, not a casual brush. It was deliberate, a claim. His fingers laced through mine, his grip firm and steady. He had been watching me, too. He had seen it all. The longing, the loneliness, the quiet desperation. He hadn't just seen it. He had understood it. My carefully constructed walls, the ones I had been hiding behind for years, crumbled into dust. The breaking point wasn't a shout. It was a whisper in the dark. It was the simple, profound pressure of his hand holding mine. "I think," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur that sent a fresh wave of shivers through me, "that I've been waiting for you to finish that story." The confession hung in the air between us, as real and tangible as his hand in mine. It wasn't just my story. It was ours. Time seemed to warp and stretch in the darkness. I had no idea how long we sat like that, his hand holding mine, the silence speaking volumes. My mind, usually a chaotic storm of overthinking, was blessedly, miraculously quiet. There was only the feeling of his skin against mine, the solid reality of his presence, the dizzying possibility of what was happening. Then, Grant moved. He released my hand, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was pulling away. My heart plummeted, but he was just shifting, turning his body towards me in the tight space of the booth. He braced one hand on the back of the seat, leaning over me. His face was a landscape of shadows, his features indistinct in the gloom, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze. "I'm going to kiss you now, Leo," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of intent, a promise. His voice was raw, stripped of all its usual calm control. It was pure, undisguised want. My response was a choked sound, a half-formed word that was part plea and part permission. He lowered his head, and his lips met mine. The first touch was soft, hesitant, a question. It was searching, asking if this was real, if this was right. I leaned into it, my eyes fluttering shut, and answered with a pressure of my own. That was all the encouragement he needed. The kiss deepened, becoming firm, sure, and breathtakingly honest. It wasn't a frantic, desperate kiss. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was the culmination of 6 months of stolen glances, of unspoken thoughts, of quiet yearning across a crowded room. It tasted of coffee and the tomato soup we'd shared, a flavor that was uniquely him, uniquely this moment. His stubble was a rough, pleasant friction against my skin. His lips were warm and soft and moved against mine with a confidence that made my knees feel weak. I lifted a trembling hand, my fingers finding their way into the thick hair at the nape of his neck. It was soft, just as I'd imagined. He made a low sound in the back of his throat, a rumble of approval, and his other arm came around me, his hand settling on the small of my back, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. He was solid, warm, and real. So incredibly real. This was the consummation of feeling, a moment so potent it seemed to suck all the air from the room. It wasn't just physical. It was an exchange, a confession made without words. I see you. I want you. I've been waiting. He shifted his weight, and the kiss became something more. He gently pushed me back, his hand on my back guiding me until I was leaning against the wall of the booth. He followed, half kneeling on the seat, his body caging mine in. The position was dominant, possessive, yet his touch was exquisitely gentle. He broke the kiss, resting his forehead against mine. We were both breathing heavily, our breath mingling in the cold air. Leo, he breathed my name like a prayer. Grant, I whispered back, my voice hoarse. He kissed me again, and this time there was more heat, more need. His tongue traced the seam of my lips, and I opened for him without hesitation. The kiss was deep, searching, and I was lost in it, lost in the feel of his body pressed against mine, the taste of him, the solid, reassuring weight of his hands on me. One hand moved from my back, sliding up my chest, his thumb stroking over my frantically beating heart. He was learning the shape of me, the rhythm of me, and I was doing the same, my hands roaming over the broad expanse of his shoulders, the firm muscles of his back. He was everything I had imagined from my lonely corner booth, and so much more. He was not a fantasy. He was warm, breathing, wanting flesh and blood. The sound of a heavy thud outside broke the spell. It was the sound of a snowplow, its engine a distant roar. The lights flickered back on. The sudden, harsh fluorescent glare was a violation. We sprang apart, blinking like startled animals caught in a headlight. The world rushed back in. The red vinyl, the chrome napkin dispensers, the half-played game of checkers on the table. It was all exactly as it had been, but everything was different. I stared at Grant, my heart still hammering. His hair was messy, his lips were slightly swollen, and his eyes were dark with an emotion I couldn't quite name. He looked as stunned as I felt. The morning after unease began before the night was even over. The spell was broken. The magical, private darkness was gone, replaced by the unforgiving light of reality. I felt a flush of embarrassment, of fear, creep up my neck. What had we just done? What did it mean? Grant slid out of the booth, his movements stiff. He didn't look at me. He walked over to the counter and stood with his back to me, his hands braced on the edge. I watched the tense line of his shoulders, and my stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. He regretted it. The thought was a punch to the gut. It was too much, too fast. I was a pathetic, lonely writer, and he was a kind man who had gotten swept up in the weird, storm-induced intimacy of the night. He was probably mortified. I needed to get out of there. I had to give him an escape, a way to pretend this never happened. I started gathering my things, my hands fumbling with my laptop, my coat. My movements were jerky, clumsy. The plow just did the main road, Grant said, his voice flat. He still hadn't turned around. The side roads will still be a mess. I'll manage, I said, my voice tight. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady. Thanks for the food. And the game. I couldn't bring myself to mention the kiss. To say it out loud would be to acknowledge the chasm of awkwardness that had just opened between us. I walked towards the door, my heart feeling like a lead weight in my chest. Each step was a monumental effort. I felt his eyes on my back, but I couldn't turn around. I couldn't bear to see the pity or regret on his face. My hand was on the doorknob when his voice stopped me. Leo, wait. I froze, my back still to him. I waited, holding my breath. I heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the linoleum floor. He stopped right behind me. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to run. I did neither. Don't go, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I finally forced myself to turn. He was standing so close I had to tilt my head back to look at him. His expression wasn't full of regret. It was uncertain, anxious even. He looked just as scared as I felt. Last night, he started, then stopped, searching for the words. He took a breath. That wasn't the storm. Or the dark. That was me. That was real. The reassurance. It was a quiet, simple statement, but it landed with the force of a revelation. The knot of fear in my stomach began to loosen. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between us for a second before he gently cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek, a soft, soothing gesture. I've wanted to do that for a long time. You have, I whispered, my voice filled with disbelief. Since the first week you started coming in, he admitted, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. I kept waiting for you to look up from that laptop and actually see me looking back. I saw you, I breathed. I was always looking. A slow smile spread across his face, the real one, the one that made his eyes crinkle. I know. He leaned in and kissed me again. It was different from the kisses in the dark. It was gentle, soft, and full of a quiet reassurance. It was a promise. When he pulled back, he didn't let go of me. He just rested his forehead against mine again, his eyes closed. I have an apartment upstairs, he said, his voice a low rumble. There's a spare room. With a bed. You're not driving anywhere tonight. I didn't sleep in the spare room. Waking up the next morning was a disorienting experience. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The light was different, the smells were wrong. Instead of the damp, pine-scented air of my cabin, there was the faint, lingering scent of coffee and something else. Something clean and masculine that was uniquely Grant. I was in his bed, tangled in his sheets. He was already gone, but the pillow next to me still held the impression of his head and a trace of his warmth. Panic, a cold and familiar companion, tried to claw its way up my throat. This was the test. The harsh light of morning after the intoxicating darkness of the night. This was where things fell apart. I had let myself be vulnerable, had slept in a near stranger's bed. What now? Do I sneak out? Leave a note? Pretend it was a dream? I forced myself out of bed, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor. I found my clothes from the night before, neatly folded on a chair. I pulled them on, my hands shaking slightly. His apartment was simple, clean, and masculine. It was the living space of a man who didn't need much. Books were stacked on the floor, a worn leather armchair sat by the window, and photos of what I assumed were his parents were on the mantelpiece. It felt like a home. I followed the smell of coffee downstairs, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The diner was quiet, the lights low. The world outside was a brilliant, blinding white, the snow-covered landscape sparkling under a clear blue sky. The storm was over. Grant was behind the counter, a clean apron tied around his waist. He was pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He looked up as I entered, and his face broke into that same slow, warm smile. The anxiety that had been choking me moments before began to recede. "Morning," he said, his voice calm and easy, as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if I woke up in his apartment every day. "Morning," I replied, my voice still thick with sleep. He pushed one of the mugs across the counter towards me. "Black, right?" "Always." I wrapped my cold hands around the warm ceramic, the gesture of familiar comfort in a sea of newness. I took a sip. It was perfect. He leaned against the counter, nursing his own mug. He didn't say anything for a minute, just watched me. I felt that familiar heat rise in my cheeks, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from being truly seen. "I usually open at 7, he said, "but I think I might be a little late today." "The town will survive," I said, a smile touching my own lips. The bell over the door jingled, startling us both. An elderly man in a thick parka, one of the regulars I recognized, peered inside. "You open, Grant." This was it. The external test. The world intruding. I instinctively took a step back from the counter, putting distance between us, ready to retreat into my role as customer. Grant didn't miss a beat. He didn't look flustered or guilty. He just gave the man a calm smile. "Morning, Frank. Give me about 15 minutes. The coffee's on, but the grill's still cold." "No problem," Frank said, taking a seat at his usual stool at the far end of the counter, pulling a newspaper from his coat pocket. Grant turned back to me. His eyes held mine, and in that single look, he communicated everything I needed to know. "I'm not hiding. I'm not ashamed. This is real." He gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible wink before turning to start his morning routine, firing up the grill, pulling out bacon, cracking eggs. I stood there for a moment, watching him. The ease with which he navigated the situation, the quiet confidence he exuded, was a balm to my anxious soul. I wasn't a dirty secret. I was just here. I knew I should leave, let him get to work. My car was probably still buried, but I could start digging it out. It was time to go back to my lonely cabin, to my empty laptop screen. The thought filled me with a familiar, hollow ache. The magic was over. I turned to go, my coffee cup still in my hand. I should stay, Grant said, not looking up from the sizzling bacon on the grill. Have breakfast. It wasn't a question. It was a gentle command. A conscious choice. He was choosing to keep me here, even with the eyes of the town, in the form of Frank at the end of the counter, upon us. So I stayed. I slid into my usual booth, but it felt different. It was no longer a hiding place. It was just a table. Grant brought me a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast a few minutes later, setting it down in front of me. His fingers brushed against mine as he pulled his hand away, a small, deliberate touch that was just for me. More regulars started to trickle in, stamping snow from their boots, their voices filling the quiet diner. They greeted Grant, took their usual seats, and the rhythm of a normal morning at the corner booth began. But I was on the inside now. I wasn't watching from behind a window anymore. I finished my breakfast, the food tasting better than anything I'd ever eaten here before. I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to go. I took my empty plate up to the counter, where Grant was pouring coffee for another customer. That was great, I said quietly. Thank you. For everything. He turned to me, his eyes soft. You're welcome. I reached for my wallet, but he put his hand over mine, stopping me. It's on the house. Grant, I can't. Leo, he said, his voice low and firm, for my ears only. Let me. He squeezed my hand gently before letting go. Then he reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out a single, worn brass key. He pressed it into my palm, closing my fingers around it. I stared at him, confused. It's for the back door, he explained, his gaze unwavering. For after hours. Or before hours. For whenever you don't want to be alone in that cabin. An offer of a shared future. It wasn't a declaration of love or a grand, romantic speech. It was a key. A simple, solid, metal key. It was access. It was trust. It was an invitation to stop being on the outside. I couldn't speak. I just stared down at the key in my hand, its weight a tangible symbol of the shift that had occurred between us. I closed my hand around it, the metal cool against my skin. I looked up at him, and my throat was too thick with emotion to form words. I just nodded. That was enough. His smile reached his eyes, warm and full of a quiet joy. I spent the rest of the day in a daze. I dug my car out of the snow, the physical labor a welcome outlet for the dizzying array of emotions swirling inside me. I drove back to my cabin, but the silence that greeted me was different. It was no longer menacing or lonely. It was just quiet. It was a blank page, waiting for a new story. And for the first time in 6 months, I wrote. The words didn't gush out in a torrent, but they came. A sentence, then a paragraph. A story about a man who thought he was invisible until someone finally took the time to truly see him. It wasn't the novel I had been trying to force. It was something new, something real. That evening, I didn't agonize over whether I should go. I didn't play games or second-guess myself. I drove back to the diner just as the last of the dinner customers were leaving. I parked my car and walked not to the front door, but around to the back. The key slid into the lock, the click of the tumbler turning a satisfying, definitive sound. I stepped inside. The diner was quiet, the air thick with the lingering smells of the day. Grant was wiping down the counter, his back to me. He didn't seem surprised to hear the door open. He just paused, his hand stilling on the counter. He turned around slowly. A smile touched his lips when he saw me standing there. Hey, he said softly. Hey, I replied, my own smile feeling wide and unfamiliar on my face. We didn't rush towards each other. There was no dramatic embrace. The quiet intimacy that had begun in the storm settled around us again, comfortable and easy. He finished wiping the counter, and I took a seat on one of the stools, my old laptop bag slung over my shoulder. How was your day? He asked, leaning against the counter opposite me. It was good, I said, and I meant it. I wrote. His smile widened. Yeah. We fell into a comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who no longer need to fill the space with words. He made us coffee, and we sat there in the dimly lit diner, the closed sign hanging in the window, shutting out the world once more. But this time, it wasn't an accident of the weather. It was a choice. I looked around the empty room, at the worn red booths and the checkered floor. This place had been my refuge from loneliness, a place where I could watch life from a safe distance. But it wasn't just a place anymore. It was a beginning. My final reflection came with a clarity that was sharp and breathtaking. For months, I had been orbiting a life I was too afraid to live, watching a man I was too afraid to want. I had mistaken observation for participation. I thought my story was about being alone. I was wrong. Grant reached across the counter and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His touch was warm, steady, and sure. It wasn't a question anymore. It was an answer. I looked from our joined hands to his face, at the quiet strength in his eyes, and I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The anxiety, the yearning, the feeling of being an outsider, it all just faded. It was replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that started in my chest and spread through my entire body. I was no longer a man watching the world through a window. I was here. I was seen. I felt like I'd come home.